Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I am back with a very belated April wrap-up. The end of April and beginning of May have been really busy, full of wonderful and exciting things, but that combined with a family emergency and Mother's Day and my mother's birthday mean that I haven't had a lot of time to film lately. Plus, we're wrapping up the school year. We have about a month to go, my school. I cannot wait. I am so ready to be done. So here I am, ready to film, and I also have some really exciting projects in the works, one of which will be coming out next week, and I really hope you enjoy it. But all of that to say, I am finally going to be able to tell you about the books that I read in April. So my classic for the month was supposed to be The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. And I have to be honest, I was not inspired to read this. I read the prologue and I made it through and I thought, okay, good. And then I saw that The Knight's Tale alone was 150 pages. And that just stopped me in my tracks, and I had no motivation to try and plow through that until one of you wonderful people suggested that I read them in size order. Because I didn't realize, and I don't know why it didn't occur to me, that these don't have to go in chronological order. You can read each person's story in any order you like. So I tabbed it up so I was able to see how long they were, and have been reading them in size order ever since. So I haven't finished this yet. I have 3 stories to go. I have, which is this one? The Franklin's Tale, and then The Wife of Bath's Tale and The Knight's Tale. Ironically, the longest ones are the most famous, so I'm waiting to have a free weekend to really devote some time to those, and then I will finally be done with it. So I will let you know my complete thoughts in my May wrap-up when I've finally finished it. In addition, my nonfiction book for the month was Brief Encounters by Susanna Fullerton. I love Susanna Fullerton as a scholarly writer. She usually writes a lot of Jane Austen scholarship. I've gotten to see her at a few AGMs for Jasna, and she is wonderful in person, very personable, very funny, and really, really knowledgeable. This book was a little bit different in that it chronicles, I want to say 10 or thereabouts, writers who visited Australia at some point between the 1830s and the 1930s. So these included writers like Robert Louis Stevenson, Agatha Christie, D.H. Lawrence. I think it ended with H.G. Wells. There were very well-known names who visited Australia. And so she recorded their impressions of Australia, where they went, and how it may or may not have been reflected in their work. I have to say, those stories, the stories of things those authors did while they were there, or how they wrote about Australia in their writings later on, were really interesting. I didn't get as much out of hearing about the places that they went because I've never been to Australia, so I could not picture where precisely in the country they were going at any given time. Basically, I need a really better grounding in Australian geography to really appreciate this book, but it was still very well written, and if you are more familiar with Australian geography, then definitely give it a read. Then we come to the other physical books that I read this month. The first was Portrait of a Scotsman by Evie Dunmore, and this is the latest in her League of Extraordinary Women series, and these are romance novels set in the Victorian period around a group of 4 suffragette friends who each fall in love with very troublesome men. In this one, we follow Hattie? Yes, Hattie, not Hetty, who falls in love with Lord Lucian Blackstone, who is in fact Scottish. And things happen from there. I enjoyed this one. Honestly, it was so long ago that my initial impressions have faded a little bit, which I suppose is a review in and of itself. I feel like I had more critical analysis of this at the beginning of the month, and like an idiot, I did not write it down. But I can say that I enjoyed it. It wasn't my favorite of the bunch, but I am really excited for book 4 when we get to see Katrina more. Lady Katrina is the last of the 4 women in this group, and based on the snippets that we saw of her, I have a feeling I'm really going to like her, so I hope I love her story even more. However, I'm very sad that that next book has been pushed out a bit. It is now coming out, I believe, in March of next year. So I've been hunting down other similar romance books to tide me over until then. And I think I've found a couple, and you'll see that in my future book hauls. Next, I read 2 books in the middle of the month, which for me lined up with the season as Easter and Passover overlapped this year, which I always enjoy. The first of those was People of the Book by Geraldine Brooks, which is about a young woman who is an expert in studying and restoring really old manuscripts. And she is called out to Sarajevo to look at the Sarajevo Haggadah, which is a Passover Seder text, which is hundreds of years old. And through her study of it and her repair of it, you then are able to find out little snippets of its history and the people that it influenced over the centuries. I enjoyed it. I didn't love it as much as I was hoping to. I feel like the ending took a strange and kind of unexpected turn, which for me didn't sit very well. I loved the historical moments. I loved her finding a stain and then flashing back to the 1600s in Venice to find out how that stain got on the page. I loved those stories. I didn't necessarily love what she did with the ending, but it is still well worth a read. I highly recommend it. The other book that I read in a similar vein was The Lost Shtetl by Max Gross. This is such a unique concept. It's about a shtetl, which is a small Jewish village in the Polish forest that has been living as though it's the beginning of the 20th century up till the present day. And they've kind of been forgotten about by the modern world. Until one day, this young couple has just gotten divorced, which is extremely rare in the community, and then they both disappear. And the town is naturally very concerned what has happened to them, so they send out a scout to try and track them down in the nearest city. And he then discovers the 21st century and ends up bringing it back with him. And then the townspeople have to grapple with how much of modernity is worth hanging on to, how much of it is destructive. This was such a fascinating book. I am still wrestling with a lot of questions that it brought up, especially, and this is kind of a trigger warning, there is some anti-Semitic feeling in this book, not the authors, and you are not supposed to agree with those characters at all. But some of the anti-Semitism that scout encounters in the city, to my mind, is just unbelievable. That in a post-Holocaust world, we are still dealing with it, even in a country that experienced the Holocaust. And Max Gross brings up a kind of logic as to how it could be allowed to fester. And it kind of makes sense, but it's still absolutely horrifying to think about. And I just loved it. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about it, so I highly recommend it, and I would love to hear what you thought. Then, because it was Shakespeare's birthday on April 23rd, I finally read Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell. I have been meaning to read this book for 2 years after all of the amazing reviews and prizes that it has gotten. I finally read it, and I loved it. If you're unfamiliar with it, it is the story of Shakespeare and his family, particularly his wife, and the point leading up to and after their son, Hamlet, dies at the age of 11. My only potential quibble with this is that it does play with history and make a lot of leaps, but the writing is so beautiful and the characters are so deeply human that it almost doesn't matter, and you want this to have been true. Of course, by this point, we will never truly know one way or another who Anne, or in this case Agnes, or William, or Judith, or Susanna were. But it was just stunning. The writing is so beautiful, so lyrical, and it sucked me in. I went through this in about 2 days. It was so, so beautiful. That's really all I can say. If you haven't read it yet, definitely, definitely do. And the last physical book I read this month was A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. This is the first in the All Souls trilogy. And I have to say, I did in fact enjoy this. It is a monster of a book. It is over 500 pages, but I've been wanting to watch the show for ages. And every now and again, people in my life will crop up saying, oh my gosh, that is my favorite series of all time. So I had to find out what they were talking about. It's the story of Diana Bishop, who is an American scholar who has come to Oxford for some research. And we also discover that she is basically a closeted witch. She knows she has magical powers. She knows that everyone in her family was a witch or a wizard, but she herself tries not to use that power as much. However, in her research in the Bodleian, she ends up unlocking a magical text completely by accident in the sight of a vampire. This is a world in which vampires and demons also exist, and she and this vampire end up forming an alliance and eventually falling in love with one another, all while trying to protect this text and find out more about Diana and her past, and how she and this text could be the key to something that could change the magical community. I didn't necessarily love some aspects of Matthew and Diana's relationship, especially at the beginning. I think you could view it as very possessive and overbearing, which put me off a little bit. But towards the end, you have spent so much time with them that you grow to love them. And I think Matthew mellows a little bit towards the end. There were sections that were a little bit gory, so if you, like me, cannot handle blood, maybe skip that chapter or two. That's what I had to do. But that doesn't happen until very close to the end. So by that point, I was so determined to finish it that I just skimmed through until it was safe again and then continued reading. So I very much enjoyed this. I'm intrigued to see where the next book goes, because there is time travel involved in that, and the Elizabethan era, which is one of my favorite eras. So I'm really excited for that, and to watch the television series to see how it matches up with what I've been reading. I then read some non-physical books as well. I read 3 Rumpole audiobooks, which means I have finished this series of audiobooks. Rumpole is an Old Bailey lawyer created by John Mortimer, and these last 3 audiobooks follow him in his older years. So here he is played by Sir Timothy West. Well, in 2 of them he was played by Sir Timothy West, and in the final one I listened to he was played by Desmond Barrett, I believe. Those titles were Rumpole on Trial and Going for Silk, Rumpole the Teenage Werewolf and Other Stories, and Rumpole and the Old Familiar Faces. The first two with Sir Timothy West I really enjoyed. I think he really captured Rumpole's curmudgeonly sarcasm and charm. And I also loved Prunella Scales as his wife, She Who Must Be Obeyed. I thought she did a wonderful job. And they were some really fun, ultimately kind of sweet and cozy mysteries. You know everything's going to be wrapped up neatly by the end of the case. On the other hand, Rumpole and the Old Familiar Faces with Desmond Barrett, I didn't enjoy as much because it was basically a repeat performance of an earlier Rumpole episode. Or at least half of it was. The second story was completely reused from an earlier episode, I think with Julian Rind Tutt. It was the one involving the pantomime, which was a real letdown. It was my final Rumpole story in the series, and it was a rerun. So that was very disappointing, but I enjoyed the other two very much. And lastly, I got really behind on my digital arcs, and I'm still very behind on them, but I managed to read one, and that was Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. And this is a retelling of part of the Ramayana, which is one of the two sacred texts of Hinduism, but retold from Kaikeyi's perspective. And apparently she is usually cast as the stepmother villain sort of character in the piece. I really enjoyed this book. I found it really enlightening, especially because I know next to nothing about Hindu mythology. I discovered that my world religion classes in high school did not even scratch the surface of how Hindu myth actually works. And so I enjoyed it. I feel like I would have enjoyed it more had I had a better grounding in the Ramayana itself. However, as luck would have it, at a recent book sale, I discovered a really nice translation of the Ramayana. So I won't say I'm going to read that immediately because it is also huge and intimidating, but I may read that at some point and then possibly revisit Kaikeyi to see if I get more out of it. That will not be for a while, but I may film that once I've actually completed that project. And lastly, I nearly forgot, I read Galatea by Madeline Miller, which was very easily done because it's only about 20 to 30 pages. But this was also wonderful. This is a retelling of the Pygmalion myth from the point of view of the statue that he creates, who Madeline Miller has named Galatea. This was fascinating. It pulls out so many things in the Pygmalion myth, and indeed in, for example, My Fair Lady, which Megan Hannett and I were discussing earlier that month, that I think a lot of people tend to overlook in favor of the romance and in order to get a happy ending. This is very dark, it's very intense, but it is so, so worth it. And it really looks at the controlling and the possessive side of things and the grooming side of things that goes on in the Pygmalion tale. If you're thinking about reading it, I would highly recommend it. You can, of course, get this cute little edition, but it has existed as an ebook for a long time, so you can check that out through Kindle or your local library and see if you can get a digital copy if you'd like as well. So there you have it. Those are all of the books that I read in April. Let me know down below if you read any of these books and what you thought, or if you have any further questions, or if you have some recommendations for me based on what I've read. I can't wait to see you soon with some new and upcoming projects, but until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.